Did you know that one out of every 26 American merchant mariners who served in World War II died? That is a higher casualty rate than any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. These were civilian volunteers. They signed up to sail ships full of bombs, tanks, and gasoline through waters hunted by enemy submarines and patrolled by long-range bombers. They had minimal training, they often had only a single gun on their slow, heavy cargo ships, yet they delivered over 270 million tons of cargo. They were the supply line, they were the reason armies could fight and nations could survive. But who were they? What did they see? And why have their stories been so often forgotten? They were old men and teenage boys, Union longshoremen and farm kids who had never seen the ocean. They sailed into icy northern seas, through tropical monsoons, and across submarine-infested oceans. They were torpedoed, bombed, and shelled. They froze in lifeboats and died of thirst under a relentless sun. And they showed a kind of bravery that is hard to comprehend. These are some of their stories. Number 20. What happens when a freighter fights a warship? The SS Stephen Hopkins was a Liberty ship. It was a slow, boxy cargo carrier, not a warship. On September 27, 1942, it was sailing alone in the South Atlantic, far from any convoy. It was a routine trip until two enemy ships appeared on the horizon. They were not other freighters. They were the German commerce freighter Stier and its supply ship, the Tannenfels. These were heavily armed vessels designed to hunt and sink ships like the Hopkins. The Stier immediately opened fire. Its shells were bigger and its guns had a longer range. The fight should have been over in minutes. The captain of the Stephen Hopkins, Paul Buck, knew he was outgunned. He could have surrendered. His crew were civilians, not trained naval gunners. But he chose to fight. He ordered the ship to turn and bring its own small armament to bear. The Hopkins had one 4-inch gun on the stern and a few smaller machine guns. That was it. The crew of the armed guard, the small U.S. Navy detachment assigned to the ship, raced to the 4-inch gun. Shells from the Stier were already hitting the Hopkins. The first salvo destroyed the radio room, so no SOS could be sent. The second smashed into the engine room, leaving the ship dead in the water. Fires started to break out across the deck. Those men were being killed and wounded. The Navy gun crew was hit. Lieutenant Kenneth Willett, the commander of the armed guard, was killed on his way to the gun. But as the Navy gunners fell, the merchant seamen took their places. They had only rudimentary training, but they kept the gun firing. The chief engineer, second mate, and others carried ammunition by hand as shells exploded around them. The battle was a brutal, one-sided affair. The Stier and Tannenfels circled the helpless American ship, pouring fire into it. The Stephen Hopkins was being torn apart. Amid the chaos, the story's most incredible moment happened. The entire Navy gun crew was dead or wounded. The 4-inch gun fell silent. Then, a 19-year-old cadet midshipman named Edwin O'Hara ran to the gun. He was just a kid, an apprentice officer learning his trade. By himself, he started loading and firing the heavy shells. He had no one to help him aim. He just kept shooting at the enemy ship. He fired the last 5 shells the ship had, and he made them count. At least one of O'Hara's shells, and others fired before him, hit the Stier. The German warship was also on fire and taking on water. The Stephen Hopkins was sinking fast. Captain Buck gave the order to abandon ship. He went down with his vessel. Edwin O'Hara was last seen being helped toward a lifeboat, but he never made it. Only 15 of the 56 men aboard the Hopkins survived. They drifted in a single open lifeboat for 31 days before they finally reached the coast of Brazil. They had no idea if their fight had meant anything. It had. The damage they inflicted on the Stier was so severe that its own crew had to scuttle it later that day. A slow, poorly armed American cargo ship had fought a German warship to a standstill and effectively destroyed it. The story comes from the official reports and the detailed accounts of the survivors, like George S. Cronk, whose testimony was crucial. For his actions, Edwin O'Hara was posthumously awarded the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal. A Liberty ship was later named in his honor. It was a sacrifice that almost no one heard about. What psychological toll did a 31-day journey in a lifeboat take on the 15 survivors? Were there detailed logs from the German raider, Stier, that described the battle from their perspective, and if so, where are they now? How many other unwinnable fights did merchant ships engage in that were never recorded because there were no survivors? Number 19, can one ship save an entire island? In the summer of 1942, the island of Malta was on the brink of collapse. It was a critical British stronghold in the Mediterranean, but it was being starved into submission by relentless air and sea attacks from German and Italian forces. Without fuel, food, and ammunition, Malta would fall, and if Malta fell, the enemy would control the entire Mediterranean Sea. The Allies put together a desperate mission to save it. It was called Operation Pedestal. It was a convoy of 14 fast merchant ships, including the American tanker SS Ohio, escorted by an enormous fleet of warships. The Ohio was the most important ship of all. Its tanks were filled with 11,500 tons of kerosene and diesel fuel, the lifeblood Malta needed to keep its fighter planes in the air. The enemy knew this. They threw everything they had at the convoy. The journey to Malta became known as the Convoy from Hell. The attack started on August 11th and did not stop. Submarines, torpedo bombers, high-level bombers, and patrol boats attacked day and night. The warships of the escort fought back fiercely, but ships began to go down. One by one, merchant vessels were hit and sunk. The sky was filled with smoke and the sea with burning oil. The SS Ohio seemed to have a target painted on it. On August 12th, a torpedo struck its port side, blowing a huge hole in the hull and knocking out its engines. The crew managed to get them running again. Then a German Stuka dive bomber was shot down, but it crashed directly onto the Ohio's deck. Another bomber dropped its load, and the concussion from the near misses buckled the ship's plates and put out its boilers. The ship was dead in the water again. Captain Dudley Mason refused to give up. The crew worked frantically, making repairs under constant attack. They were sitting duck. Another wave of dive bombers attacked. One scored a direct hit. More bombs landed all around the ship, lifting the massive tanker out of the water. Its back was broken. It seemed to be sinking. The crew was ordered to abandon ship, but then it became clear the Ohio was still afloat, just barely. Captain Mason and a skeleton crew went back aboard. The ship was a wreck, a floating catastrophe. Its decks were buckled, its engines destroyed. But it was still carrying the fuel. The decision was made to tow it. The destroyer HMS Penn was attached to the Ohio. Another HMS Ledbury was lashed to its other side to keep it from capsizing. It was a bizarre sight, a crippled, dying tanker being held up by two warships as it was slowly dragged toward Malta. The attacks continued. More bombs fell. The tow line snapped, but they reattached them. The ship's rudder was gone. The destroyers had to steer it. The story is powerfully told in books like Michael Pearson's The Ship That Wouldn't Die. The sheer determination of the crews, both American mariners and British sailors, was incredible. On August 15, 1942, what was left of the SS Ohio was finally brought into Valletta Harbor in Malta. Its decks were level with the water. It was held afloat only by the destroyers on either side, but it had made it. The fuel was delivered, Malta was saved. The island's survival was a turning point in the Mediterranean campaign. The Ohio had done its job. As soon as the last of the fuel was pumped out, the great ship settled on the harbor floor. It never sailed again. How did the combined American and British crews coordinate their efforts under such extreme stress and constant attack? What unrecorded acts of individual heroism occurred during the hours of chaos on the Ohio's deck? If the Ohio had sunk just 10 miles sooner, how would the entire course of the war in North Africa have changed? Number 18. What is the price of a scattered convoy? The Arctic convoys to northern Russia were the most dangerous journeys of the war. Ships had to battle not only enemy U-boats and aircraft, but also monstrous seas, gale force winds, and crippling ice. The route became known as the Murmansk Run. Of all the convoys that made this trip, none is more infamous than Convoy PQ-17. It set sail from Iceland in late June 1942, a massive fleet of 35 merchant ships, including 22 American vessels, loaded with tanks, planes, and other war materials for the Soviet Union. It had a heavy escort of warships, but intelligence reports suggested that a powerful German surface fleet, including the battleship Tirpitz, was about to attack. The British Admiralty in London made a fateful decision. On July 4th, they sent a signal to the convoy. Convoy is to scatter. The escorting warships were ordered to withdraw to face the German fleet, leaving the slow, heavily laden merchant ships to fend for themselves. The German surface fleet never actually attacked the convoy, but the order to scatter had turned the merchant ships into isolated, easy targets for the U-boats and bombers that were waiting for them. It was a slaughter. The story of the SS Christopher Newport is the story of PQ-17 in miniature. It was a standard American Liberty ship filled with military cargo. When the order to scatter came, its master, Captain John C. Osman, was stunned. He knew what it meant. Sailing alone in these waters was a death sentence. Soon after the attacks began, long-range bombers appeared. The Christopher Newport, along with other ships, tried to fight back with its small guns, but it was hopeless. A torpedo from an aircraft struck the ship in the engine room. The explosion killed 3 men instantly and stopped the ship dead. It was sinking. The crew, including the Navy Armed Guard, began to abandon ship, but their ordeal was just beginning. They were now in lifeboats in the freezing Arctic Ocean. Another American ship, the SS Samuel Chase, heroically stopped to pick up some of the survivors. Others were rescued by a British trawler, but the attacks on the scattered ships continued across the Barents Sea for days. Of the 35 merchant ships that started the journey, 24 were sunk. The losses were staggering. 153 merchant mariners were killed, and 2/3 of the cargo was lost. It was the worst convoy disaster of the war. The story has been analyzed in countless historical accounts, like David Irving's The Destruction of Convoy PQ-17. The decision to scatter the convoy has been debated ever since. For the mariners, it felt like a betrayal. They felt they had been abandoned, left as bait. The survivors who eventually made it to the Russian ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were traumatized. They had watched their friends die and their ships sink all around them. The psychological scars of PQ-17 lasted a lifetime. It was a stark lesson in the brutal calculus of war, where their lives and ships were deemed expendable. What was the exact wording and sourcing of the intelligence that led the Admiralty to make such a catastrophic decision? Are there classified documents that still have not been released, which could shed more light on the thinking behind the order to scatter? How did the Soviet officials on the ground in Murmansk react when only a handful of battered ships limped into port instead of the massive fleet they were expecting? Number 17. Does a hero's skin color matter? During World War II, the American military was segregated, so was much of American society, but the sea was sometimes a different place. While discrimination was still a major problem, the demands of the war created opportunities that did not exist on land. The story of the SS Booker T. Washington is a powerful example. This was a Liberty ship, like thousands of others, but it was unique. It was the first major U.S. vessel to be commanded by an African-American captain, Hugh Mulzac. Mulzac was a highly experienced mariner with a master's license, but for 20 years he had been denied a command because of his race. He had been forced to work as a steward or a cook. The war changed that. With a severe shortage of experienced officers, the U.S. Maritime Commission finally gave him his chance. But there was a condition. They wanted him to command an all-black crew. Mulzac refused. He argued that segregation had no place on a ship fighting for freedom. He insisted on a fully integrated crew representing the diversity of America. He won. When the SS Booker T. Washington was launched in 1942, its crew was a mix of 17 nationalities, including black, white, Asian, and Latino mariners. It was an experiment in equality on the high seas, and it worked. The crew was professional, disciplined, and efficient. They respected their captain, not for his race, but for his skill. Captain Mulzac, as detailed in his autobiography, A Star to Steer By, ran a tight ship. He knew the dangers they faced, and he trained his crew relentlessly for any emergency. The Booker T. Washington made 22 round-trip voyages. It sailed through the submarine-infested North Atlantic. It supported the invasions of Sicily and Normandy. It delivered troops, ammunition, and supplies to the front lines. The ship and its crew faced enemy attacks and the constant perils of the sea. They performed their duties with courage and distinction. There were never any race-related conflicts reported on board. The crew proved that men of different backgrounds could work together, live together, and fight together under the most stressful conditions imaginable. The success of the Booker T. Washington was a powerful statement against the segregationist policies of the time. It was a floating example of what America could be. Men like Charles Mills, an African-American boatswain on the ship, became role models, demonstrating leadership and skill in positions of authority. The ship was more than just a cargo carrier, it was a symbol of hope. Despite its incredible record, the story of the Booker T. Washington is not widely known. Captain Mulzac's achievement was a landmark, but it did not immediately break down the walls of discrimination in the maritime industry. After the war, he once again found it difficult to get a command, but for a few crucial years, he and his integrated crew showed the world that a ship's strength comes from the quality of its mariners, not the color of their skin. What were the private conversations and arguments within the U.S. Maritime Commission that led to the controversial decision to give Mulzac a command? Are there logs or personal diaries from white crew members that describe their initial feelings about serving under a black captain, and how those feelings changed over time? How many other highly qualified minority mariners were denied command positions during the war, and what contributions could they have made? Number 16. How long can a person endure the unendurable? The story of a torpedoed ship did not end when it slipped beneath the waves. For the survivors, it was often the beginning of a second, more personal war, the war against the sea itself. Adrift in open lifeboats, sometimes for weeks, mariners faced a different kind of enemy. There was no fighting back against the sun, the thirst, the cold, the hunger, and the despair. The ordeal of the survivors of the tanker SS Muskogee is a terrifying glimpse into this reality. On March 22, 1942, the Muskogee was torpedoed by the German U-boat U-123 in the North Atlantic. The ship was carrying crude oil. It exploded in a massive fireball. Of the 34 men on board, it is believed only a few made it off the ship alive and into a lifeboat. The U-boat commander, Reinhard Hartigen, noted the sinking in his log and moved on. For the world, the Muskogee had simply vanished. But for the men in the lifeboat, the world had shrunk to a few planks of wood on an endless ocean. They had little food and even less water. The days were a torment of blistering sun and the nights a trial of chilling cold. Their bodies wasted away. Their minds began to play tricks on them. Hope was a fragile commodity, rising with the sight of a distant ship and crashing when it passed by without seeing them. Men died from exposure, from drinking salt water in a moment of madness, or from simply giving up. We only know their story because of what happened 52 days later. On May 13th, a Swedish ship, the MS Samos, spotted the lifeboat. Inside, they found two men. They were barely alive. They were human skeletons, their skin covered in sores, their minds confused. One of them, a messman named John T. Diggs, died shortly after being rescued. The other, an ordinary seaman named Russell Tex, Starbuddy, clung to life. Tex Starbuddy was the sole survivor of the SS Muskogee. He was the only one who could tell the story of those 52 days in hell. His account, documented by the maritime authorities who interviewed him, is a harrowing record of human endurance. He spoke of the men who died one by one. He described the constant gnawing hunger and the maddening thirst. He talked about the sharks that circled the boat. He survived through an unbelievable force of will. The psychological and physical damage was immense. The story is a brutal reminder that the casualty lists of sunken ships don't tell the full story. Many men who were initially listed as missing died slow, lonely deaths days or weeks later. Researchers like Arthur R. Moore have pieced together these survival stories in books like A Careless Word, a needless sinking, showing the grim reality behind the statistics. The Muskogee's lifeboat was just one of hundreds. Thousands of merchant mariners endured similar trials. Some were rescued after a few days. Some, like Tex Starbody, lasted for an impossible amount of time. And many were never found at all, their lifeboats becoming their coffins, lost to the vast indifferent ocean. What were the day-to-day coping mechanisms the men in the Muskogee's lifeboat used to maintain sanity? Are there undiscovered logs from the U-123 that might contain observations about the immediate aftermath of the sinking? How many lifeboats from sunken ships were spotted by other vessels that, for fear of submarines, chose not to stop and rescue the survivors? Number 15. What does it take to save a burning tanker? Tankers were the most dangerous ships to serve on. There were floating bombs. A single torpedo could turn one into an inferno, giving the crew seconds, not minutes, to escape. But sometimes the crew didn't run. Sometimes they stayed and fought the fire. The story of the SS Gurney E. Newland is one of those times. On October 27, 1942, the tanker was sailing off the coast of North Carolina when it was struck by a torpedo from a German U-boat. The ship was carrying 82,000 barrels of gasoline. The explosion was immense. The entire forward part of the ship was engulfed in flames. Gasoline spilled onto the water, and the sea itself was on fire. The captain, John I. Hodges, was killed on the bridge. The order was given to abandon ship. Most of the crew jumped into the water, trying to find a patch of sea that wasn't burning. But a handful of men remained on the stern, the only part of the ship not consumed by the fire. Among them was the chief mate, Gunnar Gjertsen. They watched as their shipmates struggled in the burning water. They could have launched a lifeboat and saved themselves. Instead, they made an incredibly brave decision. They were going to try to save the ship and rescue the men in the water. They knew the ship could explode at any moment. The fire was raging and the steel bulkheads were glowing red. But they went to work. They manned the fire hoses, pouring water onto the flames and the hot steel to prevent them from buckling. They organized a rescue effort, pulling men from the water who had managed to swim to the stern. A U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Roe, arrived on the scene. The naval commander saw the burning tanker and assumed it was a lost cause. He focused on hunting the submarine and picking up survivors. He signaled to the men still on the tanker, advising them to abandon ship immediately. Chief Mate Gertsen signaled back. He refused to leave. He and his small crew were going to fight the fire. For hours, this small band of merchant mariners battled the blaze. As they were sailors, not professional firefighters, they used the ship's own limited equipment. Slowly, miraculously, they began to gain control. They contained the fire, preventing it from reaching the aft fuel tanks, which would have caused a catastrophic explosion. The story is documented in the official U.S. Coast Guard reports of the incident. By the next day, the fire was out. The Gurney E. Newland was a blackened, twisted wreck, but it was still afloat. The men had saved their ship. A salvage tug eventually arrived and towed the crippled tanker to port. Because of the courage of Gertsen and his men, a valuable ship and a portion of its cargo were saved. More importantly, they were able to rescue many of their crewmates from the water. It was an act of bravery born, not of orders, but of a refusal to give up on their ship and each other. What specific firefighting techniques, learned through minimal training, did the mariners use to control a massive gasoline fire? Are there personal letters or diaries from the crew of the USS Roe that describe their astonishment at seeing the mariners refuse to abandon their ship? How many mariners received the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal, like Gunnar Gertsen, for acts that would have earned a Navy Cross in the Armed Forces? Number 14, can you trust a broken ship in a storm? The Liberty ships were the workhorses of the war. They were built fast and cheap. Over 2,700 of them were churned out of American shipyards. They were designed to be expendable. But this rapid construction sometimes led to problems. One of the most serious was structural failure. The early Liberty ships, built with welded hulls, had a tendency to crack in the cold, rough waters of the North Atlantic. On January 16, 1943, this problem became terrifyingly real for the crew of the SS Schenectady. The tanker, a modified Liberty design, was brand new. It had just completed its sea trials and was tied to a dock in Portland, Oregon. The weather was calm. The water was still. Suddenly, with a sound like a thunderclap, the ship broke in half, the hull fractured completely, right down the middle. The bow and stern sections settled into the mud of the riverbed. The event was a major embarrassment and a huge concern for the war effort. If new ships could break apart while sitting at a dock, what would happen to them in a winter storm in the Atlantic? The incident aboard the Schenectady, thoroughly investigated by the government as documented in the records of the Ship Structure Committee, triggered a major review of shipbuilding practices. But what about the ships already at sea? The crews sailing them knew the risks. They had heard the rumors of ships cracking. They sailed anyway. The story of the SS Nicholas Gilman is a testament to the nerve of these men. In February 1944, the Gilman was in a heavy storm in the North Atlantic. The ship was being pounded by massive waves. The temperature was freezing. The crew heard a loud crack. They went to investigate and found a massive fracture running across the main deck and down the sides of the hull. The ship was literally breaking in two, held together only by the bottom plates. The captain, Ivar Bjornstad, had a terrifying choice. He could order the crew to abandon ship, but launching lifeboats in the storm would be suicidal. Or he could try to hold the ship together. He chose to try. The crew went to work. They were not shipbuilders or engineers, but they were resourceful. Using heavy steel cables and turnbuckles from the cargo gear, they essentially stitched the ship back together. They wrapped the cables around the entire vessel, tightening them to clamp the two halves of the ship and keep the crack from spreading. It was a desperate improvised solution. All the while, the storm raged, and the ship flexed and groaned beneath their feet. Any moment, the remaining steel could give way, and the ship would plunge into the icy water. For 2 days, they babied the broken ship through the storm, nursing it toward the nearest port in Iceland. They made it, the Nicholas Gilman, held together by wire, limped into harbor. The crew had saved their ship and its vital cargo. Their story, and others like it, showed a different kind of bravery. It wasn't about fighting the enemy, it was about fighting the sea itself and the very vessel they were sailing. They put their faith in their own ingenuity and refused to be beaten by a faulty weld. What were the immediate, unedited reactions of the shipyard workers and designers when they first saw the pictures of the Schenectady broken in two at the dock? How many Liberty ships developed serious cracks at sea but were lost without a trace, their fate wrongly attributed to U-boat attacks? Are there forgotten engineering reports that proposed simple fixes for the cracking problem that were ignored because they would slow down production? Number 13. What happens after the ship goes down? The sinking of a ship was not the end of the story. For some mariners, it was the start of an even more horrific ordeal. The actions of some enemy submarine commanders after a sinking went beyond the accepted rules of war. The story of the SSG Nicolet is one of the most brutal examples of this. On July 2, 1944, the Liberty ship was sailing in the Indian Ocean when it was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, the I-8. The ship was badly damaged and sinking. The crew and passengers, about 100 men in total, abandoned ship and got into lifeboats and rafts. This was a standard, if terrifying, part of maritime warfare. What happened next was not. The Japanese submarine surfaced. The survivors in the lifeboats probably expected to be questioned or perhaps ignored. Instead, the submarine crew ordered them to come aboard the submarine. The survivors were forced onto the sub's deck. Their lifeboats were riddled with machine gun fire and sunk. Then the torture began. The American mariners were bound. They were beaten with clubs and steel pipes. Some were forced to run a gauntlet of their captors, who stabbed at them with bayonets as they passed. The Japanese commander seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. According to the testimony of the few who survived, the scene was one of sadistic cruelty. After hours of this, the submarine's crew prepared to submerge. They left the bound and wounded Americans on the deck. The intention was clear: they were to be drowned. As the submarine began to dive, a few of the men managed to free themselves from their bonds. One of them was Francis J. O'Gara, a radio operator. He and a few others managed to jump into the water before the sub was fully submerged. They swam through the darkness, surrounded by the cries of their drowning shipmates. They found a single damaged life raft. Over the next 2 days, they pulled other survivors from the water. In the end, only about 24 of the 100 men from the Jean Nicolet were alive. They drifted for 2 days before being spotted by an Allied plane and rescued. The story they told was so horrific that it was used in post-war tribunals. The details are preserved in the records of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The captain of the I-8 submarine was later tried for war crimes based largely on the testimony of the Jean Nicolet survivors. This incident was not unique. While many U-boat and submarine commanders behaved with a degree of professionalism, others engaged in acts of extreme brutality against helpless survivors. These events are a stark reminder of the lawlessness that could prevail in the open ocean. For the mariners, the fear was not just of being sunk. It was of what could happen afterward, at the mercy of the enemy. Were there other crew members on the I-8 who were horrified by their captain's actions, but were too afraid to object? What was the psychological profile of a commander who could order such atrocities against unarmed civilians? Are there Japanese naval archives, still untranslated or unexamined, that contain reports of similar incidents that were never prosecuted because there were no survivors to testify? And number 12. How do you supply an invasion? The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was the largest amphibious assault in history. We often think of the soldiers who stormed the beaches. We think of the warships that bombarded the coast and the planes that filled the sky. But none of it would have been possible without the merchant mariners. An army, as the saying goes, marches on its stomach. It also fights with guns, bullets, tanks, and fuel. All of that had to be brought across the English Channel on thousands of ships, and the majority of them were merchant vessels crewed by civilians. They were the bridge of ships. The story of this massive logistical effort is a story of collective, not individual, bravery. It was a story of thousands of mariners sailing into the most heavily defended coastline in the world. Take the experience of the crew of a typical Liberty ship like the SS George G. Meade. For weeks before the invasion, they had loaded their ship with everything from ammunition to K rations. They waited in English ports, part of a vast armada. They knew something big was coming. When the orders came, they sailed into the choppy, gray waters of the Channel. They were not a fast or nimble ship. They were a fat, slow target. The waters were mined. German shore batteries could reach them. The German Air Force, though weakened, could still attack, and U-boats were known to be hunting in the area. The mariners on these ships had no foxholes to hide in. Their ship was a floating warehouse of explosives. A single well-placed shell could vaporize them. As they approached the Normandy coast, the scene was one of organized chaos. The noise was deafening: the roar of naval guns, the drone of aircraft, the chatter of machine guns. The sky was thick with smoke. Wrecked ships and landing craft littered the beaches. The job of the merchant ships was to anchor offshore and begin the dangerous process of unloading. They used their own booms and winches to lower cargo into smaller landing craft that would ferry it to the beaches. This work was slow, methodical, and incredibly dangerous. They had to do it while under fire from German artillery. Shells would land in the water around them, sending up huge geysers. A near miss could send shrapnel tearing across the deck. A direct hit was unthinkable. The crew of the George G. Meade, and hundreds of ships like it, worked around the clock for days, then weeks. They unloaded their cargo, went back to England, loaded up again, and came right back to the beaches. This shuttle service continued relentlessly. The success of the entire Normandy campaign depended on it. As documented in works like The Other D-Day by John W. L. Lee, the Merchant Marine's role was absolutely vital. Over 130 merchant mariners were killed during the Normandy campaign. Their ships were sunk by mines, torpedoes, and bombs. They were civilians, but they were on the front line. Without their steady, methodical courage, the beachhead would have failed. They didn't storm the beaches, but they made sure the soldiers who did have what they needed to fight and win. What was the emotional state of a teenage mariner on his first voyage as he sailed toward the sound of the guns at Normandy? Are there undiscovered personal logs from captains of these merchant ships detailing the near misses and daily fears they faced? How did the Allied High Command calculate the acceptable loss rate for merchant ships during the initial days of the invasion? It's number 11. Who were the coastwise sailors? Not all the danger was in the deep oceans or on the Murmansk Run. In the early part of 1942, the war came right to America's doorstep. And German U-boats launched a campaign called Operation Drumbeat against shipping along the east coast of the United States. They called it the Second Happy Time. For the U-boats, it was a turkey shoot. For the merchant mariners sailing tankers from Texas to New Jersey, it was a nightmare. They could see the lights of cities like Miami and Atlantic City from their ships, but the U.S. Navy was unprepared. There were not enough escort ships. Cities refused to black out their lights, which silhouetted the ships for the waiting U-boats. The result was a massacre. Ship after ship was torpedoed and sunk, often within sight of land. The story of the tanker SS J.W. Van Dyke is typical of this period. On March 3, 1942, it was sailing near the coast of Maryland. It was a clear night. The ship was torpedoed without warning. The explosion ripped through the vessel, which was carrying heating oil. Fires broke out immediately. The ship began to sink rapidly. The crew, many of whom were veteran coastwise, sailors who spent their careers sailing up and down the coast, had to abandon ship into the cold Atlantic water. Some were badly burned. They were so close to home, yet so desperately in danger. The survivors were eventually picked up by rescue vessels, but many of their shipmates were lost. This scene was repeated night after night. From January to August of 1942, nearly 400 ships were sunk in this American shooting gallery. The beaches of the East Coast were littered with oil, debris, and sometimes bodies. Residents of coastal towns would watch in horror as ships exploded on the horizon. The bravery of the mariners who sailed these routes was immense. They knew the odds. Every trip was a gamble. They would say goodbye to their families at the docks, knowing they might be sailing into an ambush just a few miles offshore. Yet they kept sailing. The oil and gasoline they carried were essential for the war effort on the home front and for shipping overseas. Without them, factories would shut down and cities would go cold. Historians like Homer Hickam in his book Torpedo Junction have chronicled this forgotten battle. As it was a period of intense vulnerability and great loss, the mariners felt like they were being sacrificed. They pleaded for convoys and air cover. Eventually, the Navy implemented a convoy system and improved its anti-submarine tactics, and the U-boat threat on the coast was brought under control. But for those first 8 months of 1942, the sailors of the coastwise fleet were on their own. They were fighting the war in their own backyard, and they were paying a heavy price. What was the content of the desperate radio messages sent from ship's captains to the U.S. Navy as they were being attacked within sight of the American coast? Are there declassified government memos that reveal the debates and delays in Washington, D.C. about implementing a convoy system? How did the morale of the coastal communities hold up as they watched ship after ship burn and sink just off their shores? Number 10. What does a doctor do when there is no doctor? Merchant ships were not hospitals. They had a small sick bay and a medicine chest, but they rarely had a doctor. The person responsible for the crew's health was usually the purser or a pharmacist's mate. They had basic first aid training, but they were not surgeons. But in the middle of the ocean with a man's life on the line, they had to become surgeons. The story of the purser on the SS Santa Elisa is a dramatic example. In November 1942, the ship was part of Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. During the landing, a crewman named George Gonzalez was badly wounded by shrapnel from an exploding shell. His leg was mangled, and the ship's officers could see that he had a severed artery. He was bleeding to death. The ship's purser, whose name is recorded in some accounts as Robert K.H. Drinnick, was the only one with any medical knowledge. He had no surgical instruments, no operating room, and no training for this kind of emergency, but he knew Gonzalez would die in minutes without immediate action. Using a razor blade and a pair of pliers from the engine room, he went to work. The ship was in a combat zone, with the sound of explosions all around. The sick bay was little more than a closet, but the purser calmly and methodically did what he had to do. He managed to locate the severed artery and, using the pliers, clamp it shut to stop the bleeding. It was a crude, desperate act of battlefield surgery. But it worked. George Gonzalez's life was saved. He was later transferred to a proper hospital ship, where surgeons were amazed that he had survived. This kind of medical improvisation was not uncommon. There are many stories of pursers, mates, and even captains setting broken bones, stitching up terrible wounds, and even performing emergency amputations with nothing but a meat saw and a bottle of whiskey for anesthetic. These acts required a special kind of courage. It wasn't the heat of the moment bravery of a gun battle. It was the cold, calculated courage to cut into another human being, knowing that you were their only hope and that a single mistake could be fatal. These impromptu surgeons were often haunted by what they had to do. They were ordinary seamen forced by extraordinary circumstances to take on the responsibilities of a doctor. Their stories are a little-known chapter in the history of the Merchant Marine, a testament to their resourcefulness and their profound sense of duty to their shipmates. The Maritime Commission's records on medals awarded, such as the Merchant Marine Mariner's Medal, often cite these acts of medical heroism. How many mariners died from wounds or illnesses at sea that could have been easily treated by a qualified doctor? What kind of long-term psychological trauma did the medics of last resort suffer after being forced to perform these grim procedures? Are there undiscovered ship's logs that contain matter-of-fact descriptions of these incredible medical emergencies, written by the very men who performed the surgery? Number 9. Can a ship be its own worst enemy? Not every danger came from the enemy. The cargo these ships carried was often as deadly as any torpedo. They were sailing on floating volcanoes. A ship loaded with thousands of tons of ammunition could be vaporized by a single spark. A tanker full of high-octane gasoline was a time bomb. The crew lived with this knowledge every day. The story of the SS El Estero is a chilling example of this danger. In April 1944, the El Estero was docked in Bayonne, New Jersey, right next to New York City. It was being loaded with 1,500 tons of bombs and ammunition destined for the war in Europe. Suddenly, a fire broke out deep in the ship's hold. The situation was catastrophic. If the fire reached the ammunition, the resulting explosion would not just destroy the ship. It would likely detonate the ammunition on the adjacent docks and on other nearby ships. The blast could devastate the entire port of New York and parts of the city. It would be one of the biggest man-made explosions in history. The dock workers and the ship's crew began to fight the fire, but it was spreading fast. The city's fireboats raced to the scene, pouring water onto the ship, but the fire was too deep inside. The steel plates of the hull were starting to glow red. They were running out of time. The ship was about to blow. A group of merchant mariners and harbor pilots made a decision of incredible bravery. They decided that the only way to prevent the explosion was to sink the ship. They boarded the burning vessel, knowing it could disintegrate at any moment. They worked in the thick, choking smoke, trying to open the ship's sea cocks to flood it. The heat was intense, the valves were stuck, they couldn't get them open. With time running out, the harbor pilot, John J. Mackey, came up with a new plan. He ordered tugboats to pull the burning ship away from the docks and out into the harbor. The idea was to scuttle it in deeper water. But as they pulled it, the ship was listing badly, threatening to capsize and spill its burning cargo. So they made one last desperate move. They intentionally grounded it on a shoal in the harbor. Then the fireboats surrounded the half-sunk ship and pumped millions of gallons of water into it until the fire was finally extinguished. They had done it. They had averted a disaster that would have been unimaginable. The men who boarded that ship, the merchant mariners, pilots, and firefighters, were heroes. They didn't face a human enemy, but they faced certain death to save thousands of lives and a vital part of the war effort. The story, detailed in official Coast Guard reports and local news archives from the time, is a powerful reminder that the war was fought not just on distant battlefields, but in the heart of America's cities by civilians who rose to the occasion. What was the exact cause of the initial fire on the El Estero, and was sabotage ever seriously considered as a possibility? How did the political leaders of New York City and military authorities coordinate their response in the terrifying hours when a massive explosion seemed imminent? Are there personal accounts from the tugboat crews who had the terrifying job of pulling a floating bomb across the harbor? Number 8. How do you fight back when you're the target? Merchant ships were not designed to be fighters. They were designed to carry cargo, but they were not entirely defenseless. Most were equipped with a few guns, usually a single larger gun on the stern and some machine guns, manned by a small U.S. Navy armed guard crew. The merchant seamen often trained alongside the Navy gunners. They were a team, and sometimes these teams fought back with incredible success. The story of the tanker SS Stanvac Calcutta is a prime example. On June 6, 1942, the tanker was sailing alone in the South Atlantic when it was attacked by a German U-boat. The submarine surfaced and began shelling the ship. This was a common tactic. The U-boat commander preferred to use his deck gun to save his precious torpedoes. The captain of the Stanvac Calcutta, Alf Axelson, was a tough Norwegian American. He was not going to be an easy target. Instead of just trying to run, he began to maneuver his ship wildly, making it a difficult target to hit. At the same time, the Navy Armed Guard, commanded by Lieutenant William A. Mason, opened fire with their own deck gun. It was a duel. A U-boat versus a tanker. The U-boat was a smaller target and had a trained naval crew, but the Americans were determined. The merchant seamen worked to keep the ship moving, to feed ammunition to the gun, and to put out the small fires started by the German shells. The gunnery exchange was intense. The U-boat scored several hits on the tanker, but the American gunners were finding their range too. Then they got a direct hit. A shell from the Stanvac Calcutta's gun slammed into the conning tower of the U-boat. The German submarine was badly damaged. It began to fire erratically, and then it tried to dive. But the damage was too severe. It resurfaced, clearly in trouble. The American gunners kept firing, scoring more hits. The U-boat finally went down for good. The crew of the Stanvac Calcutta watched as debris and oil came to the surface. They had done the impossible. A merchant tanker had fought and sunk a U-boat in a gun battle. It was a rare and stunning victory. The story is verified by both American and German war records, which confirm the loss of the U-157 in that area on that date. For their actions, several members of the crew, both merchant, marine, and navy, received medals. The victory of the Stanvac Calcutta and others like it sent a powerful message. It told the U-boat commanders that American merchant ships were not just helpless victims. They would fight back. Every time a ship fought back, even if it was ultimately sunk, it forced the U-boat to be more cautious, to use a valuable torpedo instead of its deck gun, and to spend more time submerged. The aggressive defense of these mariners and sailors was a crucial, if often overlooked, part of the battle against the U-boats. What was the mood and conversation among the crew of the Stanvac Calcutta in the moments after they realized they had actually sunk their attacker? Are there any surviving relatives of the U-boat crew who could provide insight into the men who were on the receiving end of that fatal gun battle? How many other U-boats were damaged or forced to abort their patrols because of the unexpectedly fierce resistance from merchant ships? Number 7. What's the last thing you see? For some mariners, the end came with terrifying speed. There was no battle, no time to launch lifeboats, no chance to fight back. Just a sudden, violent annihilation. This was often the fate of ships on the Murmansk Run, where they faced not just U-boats but also land-based torpedo bombers. The ordeal of the SS Penelope Barker is a grim illustration of this kind of attack. In January 1944, the Liberty ship was part of convoy JW-56B heading for Russia. The convoy was spotted by German reconnaissance planes. A wolf pack of U-boats and a squadron of torpedo bombers were sent to attack. The crew of the Penelope Barker knew they were in trouble. The weather was brutal, with freezing temperatures and high seas. They were on high alert, with lookouts straining their eyes in the gray twilight of the Arctic. The first attacks came from the U-boats. Ships in the convoy began to be hit. The mariners on the Penelope Barker could see the explosions and the distress flares from other vessels. They knew their turn could come at any moment. Then the bombers arrived. They came in low and fast, skimming the waves to avoid radar. For the gun crews on the merchant ships, it was an almost impossible task to hit them. The planes would release their torpedoes and then bank away, disappearing into the gloom. A torpedo struck the Penelope Barker on its starboard side. The explosion was devastating. It tore a huge hole in the ship, and the icy Arctic water began to pour in. The ship immediately took on a heavy list. It was sinking, and sinking fast. The captain, James E. Fagan, gave the order to abandon ship. The crew scrambled for the lifeboats. But they had only minutes. The ship was going down by the stern. The angle became so steep that it was almost impossible to stand on the deck. Men slid into the freezing water. A few managed to get a lifeboat launched, but the ship was already disappearing beneath the waves. It took less than 10 minutes from the moment the torpedo hit until the Penelope Barker was gone completely. 16 men from the ship died. Some were killed in the initial explosion, others froze to death in the water within minutes. The survivors in the lifeboat were picked up by a British escort ship, but they were suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. They were the lucky ones. Their story, found in the official convoy reports and naval archives, was repeated many times on the Murmansk run. It was a war of sudden impersonal violence. One moment you were on a solid steel deck, the next you were in a frozen hell. There was no glory, just a constant, grinding fear and the knowledge that your life could be extinguished in an instant. What were the final, frantic communications between the Penelope Barker and the convoy's escort commander? Are there German Air Force archives that contain the pilot's report after attacking the convoy, likely just a cold notation of a successful hit? For the survivors, what were the long-term psychological effects of witnessing their ship and their friends vanish in a matter of minutes? Number 6. How do you start a war? For the United States Merchant Marine, the war started long before Pearl Harbor. American ships were carrying supplies to Britain and other allies as part of the Lend-Lease program. They were sailing in dangerous waters, and they were considered fair game by the enemy. The first American merchant ship to be sunk by German action was the SS Robin Moore. On May 21st, 1941, more than 6 months before the U.S. officially entered the war, the Robin Moore was sailing from New York to South Africa. It was a general cargo ship carrying no military supplies. It was clearly marked as an American vessel. In the middle of the Atlantic, it was stopped by a German U-boat, the U-69. The U-boat commander ordered the ship to stop and told the crew and passengers they had 30 minutes to abandon ship before he sank it. The captain of the Robin Moore, Edward Myers, protested that his ship was a neutral vessel. The U-boat commander was unmoved. The crew and 8 passengers, including a woman and a child, scrambled into 4 lifeboats. They watched as the U-boat first fired a torpedo into their ship and then surfaced to finish it off with its deck gun. The Robin Moore sank, leaving its survivors alone in the middle of the ocean. The U-boat commander gave them a small amount of food and then sailed away, offering no further assistance. The ordeal of the survivors had just begun. The 4 lifeboats were separated. For the next 2 weeks, they drifted. They faced storms, sharks, and the ever-present dangers of thirst and starvation. One boat with 11 people was eventually picked up by a British ship. Another boat, with Captain Myers and others, was found by a Brazilian vessel after 13 days. The fate of the other 2 boats was unknown for a time. A 3rd boat was eventually rescued, but the 4th was never seen again. 11 men vanished without a trace. The sinking of the Robin Moore caused a major diplomatic incident. President Franklin D. Roosevelt condemned it as an act of piracy and a clear violation of international law. He used the incident to build public support for a more aggressive stance against the Axis powers. The story of the sinking and the survival of the crew is a matter of public record, detailed in State Department documents and news reports from the time. For the mariners, it was proof that the war was already here. They were on the front lines, whether the country was officially at war or not. They were sailing unarmed ships into a war zone, and they were being targeted. The sinking of the Robin Moore was the first of many. It was the opening shot in a long and brutal battle for the supply lines, a battle that the Merchant Marine would fight until the very last day of the war. What was the exact conversation translated between the U-boat commander and Captain Myers in the moments before the sinking? Did the German Naval High Command issue a reprimand or a commendation to the U-boat commander for sinking a neutral ship? For the 11 men in the 4th lifeboat who were never found, what was their ultimate fate, and how long did they survive? Number 5. When is the war really over? The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, a day known as VE Day. There was celebration across the Allied world. But for the merchant mariners still at sea, the danger was not over. German U-boats were still operating, and some commanders did not obey the order to surrender. On May 5th, 1945, just 2 days before the final German surrender, the Collier SS Black Point was sailing near the coast of Rhode Island. It was on a routine trip carrying coal from Virginia to Massachusetts. The war was, for all practical purposes, finished. The crew was likely looking forward to going home. Suddenly, a massive explosion tore through the stern of the ship. It had been hit by a torpedo from the German submarine U-853. The ship sank in less than 15 minutes. 12 men were killed, including the ship's cook and the chief engineer. The rest of the crew were thrown into the cold water, where they were rescued by nearby vessels. The sinking of the Black Point was the last sinking of an American merchant ship by a German U-boat in the Atlantic. It was a final tragic act in a long and brutal campaign. The U.S. Navy immediately launched a massive hunt for the U-boat. They found the U-853 the next day and destroyed it with depth charges, killing its entire crew. The wreck of the U-boat still lies on the seabed off the coast of Rhode Island, a popular but dangerous dive site. The story of the Black Point is a poignant reminder that war does not end cleanly on a specific date. For the men who died on that ship, the war ended just a little too late. Their loss, so close to the finish line, was particularly bitter. It highlights the constant, unrelenting nature of the danger that merchant mariners faced. They were at risk from the first day to the last. The details of the sinking are well documented in U.S. Navy and Coast Guard reports. The incident serves as a final, bloody punctuation mark on the Battle of the Atlantic. It underscores the fact that, even when the headlines were declaring victory, the men on the front lines of the supply war were still in mortal danger. Why did the commander of the U-853 choose to attack a ship after the unofficial ceasefire orders had been sent out? Was it a final act of defiance, or did he genuinely not receive the command to stand down? Are there personal effects or logs still sealed inside the wreck of the U-853 that could answer these questions? For the families of the 12 men killed on the Black Point, how did they cope with the knowledge that their loved ones died after the war was essentially over? Number 4. What is the sound of a ship's soul? The SS President Harrison was not a cargo ship, it was a luxury liner. Before the war, it carried wealthy tourists across the Pacific. But in 1941, it was pressed into service, helping to evacuate American citizens and Marines from China as tensions with Japan rose. On December 8th, 1941, December 7th in the U.S., the ship was near the mouth of the Yangtze River, trying to make a run for it. The captain, Orella Pearson, received the news by radio Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The United States was at war with Japan. He knew his ship, now in enemy waters, was a prime target. A Japanese bomber and a warship were already closing in. Captain Pearson had no weapons to fight back. His only option was to save his crew and prevent his valuable ship from falling into enemy hands. He made a difficult decision. He ordered the ship to run aground at full speed. He aimed for the coast, pushing the engines to their limit. The great liner plowed into the shore, tearing a huge gash in its hull and sealing its fate. The crew had sabotaged the ship's machinery, but Captain Pearson wanted to make sure it could never be used by the enemy. He had saved his crew from being sunk at sea, but their ordeal was just beginning. The Japanese captured the entire crew of 160 men. They became some of the first American civilian prisoners of the Pacific War. They were sent to prison camps in China, where they would spend the next 4 years in brutal captivity. They endured starvation, disease, and cruel treatment. Many of them died in the camps. The story of their long imprisonment is a testament to their resilience. The book The President's Crew by Carl J. Fritz details their experience from the grounding of the ship to their eventual liberation in 1945. The captain's decision to ground the ship was an act of defiance. He treated his ship not just as a piece of property, but as something with a soul, something that should not be surrendered. He chose to destroy it rather than let it serve the enemy. The story of the SS President Harrison is different from many other merchant marine stories. It is not about a battle with a submarine or a fight against a fire. It is about a different kind of bravery, the courage to make a sacrifice, to choose a known hardship capture over the possibility of a worse fate, and to deny the enemy a prize. It is also a reminder that for many mariners, especially in the Pacific, the war did not end with a rescue from a lifeboat. It ended with years of suffering in prisoner of war camps. What attempts did the Japanese make to refloat and repair the President Harrison after it was run aground? Are there undiscovered diaries or letters from the imprisoned crew that provide more detail about their daily life and resistance in the prison camps? How did the experience of being civilian prisoners, without the official status of military POWs, affect their treatment and their eventual recognition by the U.S. government? Number 3, where do you find a leader? In the chaos of a torpedo attack, leadership is everything. A calm voice and a clear head can be the difference between life and death. Captain Paul Buck of the SS Nathaniel Hawthorne was that kind of leader. In November 1942, his ship was torpedoed in the Caribbean. The explosion was massive and the ship began to sink quickly. The crew rushed to abandon ship. But in the darkness and confusion, one of the lifeboats capsized, throwing its occupants into the oil-covered water. Another lifeboat was damaged. It was a scene of panic and disarray. Captain Buck, despite having sustained injuries himself, remained on the bridge of his sinking ship until he was sure everyone else was off. He then made his way to a lifeboat. From there, he took command of the situation. He directed the rescue of the men in the water. He organized the flotilla of lifeboats and rafts, ordering them to stay together. He took an inventory of their meager supplies of food and water and instituted strict rationing. He was a beacon of calm in a sea of chaos. His authority was unquestioned. The men, many of whom were terrified and in shock, looked to him for direction, and he provided it. For several days, Captain Buck led his group of survivors. He kept their spirits up. He navigated by the stars. He made the difficult decisions about who got how much water. His leadership was the glue that held the men together. They were eventually rescued, and it was widely acknowledged that Captain Buck's actions had saved many lives. His story is not one of dramatic, single-handed heroism, but of the steady, essential courage of a good leader. It is a type of bravery that is often overlooked. It doesn't involve firing a gun or fighting a fire, but it is just as vital. The official citations for the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal, which Captain Buck received, are filled with stories like his, stories of captains and officers who, after their ships were gone, continued to lead their crews through the ordeal of survival. The Merchant Marine was a melting pot of characters. There were seasoned professionals and young men on their first trip. In moments of crisis, leaders emerged. Sometimes it was the captain, sometimes it was a chief mate or a boatswain. Sometimes it was just an ordinary seaman who kept his head while others were losing theirs. These leaders, documented in countless survivor reports and maritime records, were the backbone of the service. They were the ones who ensured that the discipline and order of a ship were not lost when the ship itself was. What specific training did Merchant Marine officers receive in lifeboat command and survival leadership? Are there oral histories from the enlisted men who served under captains like Paul Buck that describe the impact of his leadership on their morale? How many groups of survivors were lost at sea because of a lack of effective leadership in the lifeboats? Number 2, how do you sail a ship made of ice? The dangers of the Murmansk run were not just from the enemy. The weather itself was a relentless foe. In the winter, the ships would become coated in ice. Sea spray would freeze instantly onto the decks, the rigging, and the guns. This ice could add hundreds of tons of weight to a ship, making it top-heavy and dangerously unstable. If it was not removed, the ship could capsize. The story of the SS James O'Farrell in January 1945 illustrates this constant battle. The ship was part of a convoy to Russia. It sailed into a storm that was so cold and violent that it was unlike anything the veteran sailors had ever seen. The ship became a ghost, completely white with frozen spray. The ice was everywhere. It was feet thick on the decks. It encased the lifeboats, making them unusable. It jammed the mechanisms of the guns, rendering them useless. The crew had to wage a constant war against the ice. They worked in shifts around the clock in sub-zero temperatures and screaming winds. They used steam hoses to try to melt the ice. They used axes and sledgehammers to chip it away. It was back-breaking, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous work. A slip on the icy deck could send a man sliding into the freezing ocean, where survival would be measured in minutes. The weight of the ice was making the ship shipless badly. The captain knew that if the storm got any worse, or if they took on any more ice, the James O'Farrell would roll over and sink. There would be no dramatic explosion, just a quiet, final surrender to the elements. The crew's fight against the ice was a fight for their lives. The accounts of these ice convoys found in books like The Arctic Convoys by Richard Woodman describe a surreal and hellish world. The men suffered from frostbite and exhaustion, but they kept working. They knew that if they stopped, they would die. After days of this brutal work, the storm finally broke, and they managed to clear enough ice to make the ship stable again. This was a kind of bravery that had nothing to do with the enemy. It was a battle of human endurance against the raw power of nature. The mariners on the Arctic route had to defeat the weather before they could even think about defeating the U-boats and bombers. Their victory was not measured in sunken submarines, but in inches of ice chipped away from a frozen deck. It was a slow, grueling form of heroism that was essential to keeping the supply lines open. What were the long-term health effects, like arthritis and respiratory illnesses, on the men who endured these freezing conditions? Are there meteorological records that could reconstruct the exact severity of the storms these convoys faced? Storms that were often beyond the normal scale. How many ships that were reported as sunk by enemy action in the Arctic were actually lost because they capsized due to ice and storms, with the enemy simply claiming credit? Number one, why did they go? This is perhaps the most important question of all. Why did these men do it? They were civilians. Most could have found safer jobs on shore. They were paid, but not enough to justify the risk. The casualty rate was astronomical. They knew that every time they sailed, there was a 1 in 26 chance they would not come back. So why did they go? The answer is complex. For some, it was patriotism. They believed in the cause and wanted to do their part. For others, it was a sense of adventure, a chance to see the world. For many, especially early in the war, it was simply a job. They were professional sailors. The sea was their life, but as the war went on and the losses mounted, something else took over. It was a sense of duty, a duty to their country, but also a duty to their shipmates. They were part of a crew. They depended on each other. They would sail with men they had just met, but on a ship in the middle of a war zone, those men became brothers. They also felt a duty to the soldiers on the front lines. They knew that the tanks they were carrying, the fuel, the food, were desperately needed. They saw themselves as a vital link in the chain. This sense of purpose is a common theme in the oral histories and letters collected by institutions like the American Merchant Marine Museum. Consider the story of an unnamed teenage messman on his first trip. He signs on in New York, excited. On the second day out, the ship is torpedoed. He finds himself in a lifeboat, watching men die. He is rescued, taken back to shore, and given a few days off. He is traumatized. He never wants to see the ocean again, but his Union Hall calls. There is another ship, and it needs a crew. And he goes, this happened thousands of times. Mariners would be sunk, survive, and sign right back up for another trip. This recycling of survivors was common. It was not because they were fearless. It was because they had a job to do. The Merchant Marine was officially recognized as a branch of the armed forces for veteran status only in 1988, long after most of the men had died. For decades, they were the forgotten heroes. They fought in every theater of the war. They made every invasion possible. They kept Britain from starving and the Soviet Union from collapsing. They did it without parades, without the same recognition as the soldiers and sailors they supplied. They did it because it had to be done. The final, and perhaps greatest, act of bravery for the Merchant Marine was their collective decision, man by man, ship by ship, to keep sailing into harm's way over and over again. Why did it take the U.S. government over 40 years to grant veteran status to the merchant mariners of World War II? Are there still undiscovered caches of letters in attics and basements across America written by these mariners that could give us a deeper, more personal understanding of their motivations? And finally, in a world that still relies on global shipping, have we truly learned the lesson about the importance and the vulnerability of the civilians who crew the world's supply lines?